Now, harmony is one of the fundamental aspects of most styles of music in addition to rhythm and melody, and it is present across almost every style of music that you can think of as a fundamental aspect. You can sort of conceptualize the idea of the history of music as the history of trying to make two or more sounds, when played together, sound good together. One of the ways that we do this in the West has been informed by Western harmonic standards, which were first categorized and made official, quote unquote, in 18th century Western Europe, where classical composers and musicians came up with multiple different ideas known as the common practice, which has influenced Western music since then. One of the ideas was that of consonance and dissonance, which is a way of conceptualizing relationships between different notes, which is the intervals between them, as consonance, which is pleasant or stable, like a major third, or dissonant, which is unpleasant, unstable, harsh, like a minor second. But this isn't the only way that you can conceptualize music, and this specific way is definitely not universal at all. There are many different ways and many different factors that you can use to analyze this, and there is consequently a lot of research into that. So first, let's look at some of that. First is the pleasantness of sensory dissonance is mediated by musical style and expertise by Popescu. This used a survey method across multiple different populations in terms of musical expertise and familiarity and musical sophistication, and eventually showed that being able to conceptualize something that is dissonant as also pleasant is related to having that musical expertise, that musical sophistication, and that musical expertise is significantly correlated with that kind of rating. And it concluded that the ideas of Western harmony and the ideas of dissonance as being pleasant or unpleasant is definitely not inherent. Now, there's cultural familiarity and musical expertise impact the pleasantness of consonance and dissonance, but not its perceived tension, by Ledesma and Urola. This had, again, a survey method across multiple different populations worldwide across levels of familiarity with Western culture and Western music theory. It examined specifically different factors of harmony like consonance, tension, pleasantness, roughness. And it essentially concluded, again, that cultural familiarity can impact how pleasant we think a certain harmony is to a significant degree. One of their specific conclusions, which we'll get back to later, is that the most useful synonym for consonance across levels of familiarity with Western music is tension, whereas pleasantness is less so. Finally, there's indifference to dissonance in native Amazonians reveals cultural variation in music perception by McDermott, Schultz, Unduraga, and Godoy. This, again, used a method in which they looked at the aesthetic responses to different styles of harmony across similar populations in America, Bolivia, and this one specific native Amazonian tribe that had no contact, essentially, with Western music, called the Tsimane. The Tsimane rated consonant and dissonant intervals and harmony and melodies as equally pleasant, despite having otherwise Western-style aesthetic responses. This essentially shows that preference can vary wildly across cultures, and the ideas that we have of consonant good, dissonant bad are by no means universal, and essentially shows, again, that there's a whole lot of interesting stuff to be shown here. Now, the impacts of this style of research into music cognition and harmony perception are cross-disciplinary, having impacts in terms of cultural studies, philosophy, even the study musicology itself, physics, sociology. Just as an example, let's look at the unique benefits that can have into cognitive research. According to Pierce, there are 3 specific ways in which music is important to cognitive research. First is its ubiquity across cultures and in everyday life for most people. Second is its unique role in sociology, human development, and evolutionary psychology. And third is the way in which it activates many different parts of the brain at once and in a unique way that is useful for cognitive mapping. Which leads us to the research question. To what degree are correlations between perceived harmonic factors associated with musical sophistication and preferences? Now, this is essentially new territory. because even though, as we've seen, there have been quite a few studies into those perceived harmonic factors and how they can relate to each other, solely focusing on correlations of those factors within different subgroups has not been done. There is nothing like this that has been published, period. This is important because looking at those correlations between those factors for different groups can provide a unique window into different groups' preconceived notions and ideas and their lines of thinking about harmony and how that has been shaped by the music styles that they listen to and their levels of music education. Now, the method first was a survey, which I created on Google Forms and sent out sent out in which the participants would rate 4 different musical selections in terms of musical consonance, in terms of pleasantness, and in terms of tension. Now these, here are the selections right here. As you can see, they are almost entirely the same except in terms of harmony. That one is is basic triads. That one is the triads plus 7th intervals. That's the triads plus 11th intervals. And this one is essentially just atonal and very harshly dissonant. So the only thing that's being changed here, the only variable is the actual intervals and harmony itself. So after having done that, the participants looked at background. The participants rated themselves in different background factors, such as they self-rated in musical sophistication, which was with their familiarity with music theory and performance, as well as choosing what genres they listen to on the normally. This was then followed up by analysis of of the data that was gathered, which took the form of collating, looking into different groups, running a whole lot of different correlations within different self-identified subgroups. The hypothesis was that sophistication and preference were going to be incredibly important factors in determining these correlations between different ideas. The results, I gathered 214 survey responses with 48 different correlations being yielded at the end. 16 of those correlations were just overall correlations of the participant pool as a whole, and the other 32 were looking into specific self-identified subgroups. Now let's look at the correlations of different levels of sophistication. Just for the sake of brevity here, I've created a group of musicians and non-musicians, musicians being those who rated their musical sophistications as high, and the non-musicians are those who rated their own musical sophistications as being low. As we can see here, the musicians had similar correlations between perceived consonance and pleasantness as the mean, but non-musicians' consonance-pleasantness correlation was much lower. Both of these groups, interestingly, had consonance-tension correlations much lower than the mean, with non-musicians being drastically lower. And non-musicians had pleasantness-tension correlations similar to the mean, whereas the musicians' correlation was much weaker. And then, again, for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to be going over the strongest and weakest correlations across groups of listeners of different genres. The strongest correlation for consonance pleasantness was in classical, the weakest was experimental, and for both consonance and tension and perceived pleasantness and tension, it was electronic listeners were the strongest and jazz listeners were the weakest correlations. Now let's get into what this actually means, our conclusions. First off, the non-musician consonance and pleasantness correlation was actually very interesting because it showed pretty conclusively that familiarity can be associated with conflation of the two factors of consonance and pleasantness. Musicians generally prefer this idea of what they perceive as consonant intervals. However, because the non-musicians had such a low correlation between consonance and pleasantness, it can actually be seen that low familiarity actually can make it a lot more subtle than that. The correlation between perceived pleasantness and perceived tension for musicians was the lowest pleasantness and tension correlation of any self-identified subgroups. They're essentially able to distinguish well. This is most likely due to how in musical education the idea of tension is pretty core to the idea of what makes quote unquote good harmony. So it's much easier for a musician to hear something, think that it is both tense but still in the end completely pleasant, and shows that there are significant extrinsic factors in terms of how we consider different intervals pleasant or not. One interesting thing was that the consonance pleasantness correlation for the overall group was greater and stronger than the consonance and tension correlation. This seems to go against the findings of Imre Ledoma and Tuomas Irola, because they suggested that consonance and tension were closer together than consonance and pleasantness. However, this is sort of the exception that proves the rule, because Ledoma's method looked at all levels of familiarity with Western music theory, and whereas we're specifically in the context of the United States of a population that is just essentially only listening to Western music, their idea of pleasantness is going to align much closer to these Western ideas of consonance and harmony. Plus the consonance tensions correlation was still significant and rather strong, which still aligns with the findings of Ledoma, and again just goes to show that culture can correlate to our preference for different types of harmony rather strongly. Of course, for jazz listeners, the correlation constant for perceived pleasantness and perceived tension was quite low. This is to be expected because of complicated patterns of tension and the just sort of baseline of tension that is involved in jazz music as a whole, that they're more likely to think that that's pleasant. The single strongest correlation constant in the entire study is that between perceived consonance and pleasantness for classical listeners. Again, this is significant evidence that that culture shapes harmonic preference strongly, because it's people who listen to classical music who are directly engaging most with that Western European classical tradition that where the idea of consonance as pleasantness comes from. Also, the average self-rated musical sophistication of different genre listeners was found. The highest was classical, jazz, and rhythm and blues, and the lowest musical sophistication that was self-rated came from people who listen to country, rap, and pop music. The overall conclusion as relating back to the research question and the hypothesis was that sophistication and taste do predict deviation from the norm, but to varying degrees. There are only a few subgroups that are actually significant in their deviation from the average, such as listeners of country music or classical music, jazz music. Even in groups that are on the extreme ends of self-rated musical sophistication, aren't always reliably different from the norm in their perception and conceptualization of harmony. So the hypothesis is correct to a degree. Now, let's look at the limitations of this. There can't really be any, the causal implications are rather limited by the fact that only correlations were established, even though all the causal claims that I've been making are backed up by prior research. The participant pool was largely secondary school age males, which can limit it quite a bit. There was no regulated testing environment, which could impact perception and ratings quite a bit, even though most of them were listening through headphones. And there was also no explanation of what the factors of consonance, pleasantness, and tension meant. This was intentional as we were trying to find out specifically their preconceived notions of these ideas. However, it does serve as a distinction from other similar studies. Now, recommendations for future research are for this method to be replicated in non-Western audiences in order to fully demonstrate the ideas that are at play. And again, also, if you really want to look at how cultural and sociological factors shape perception of harmony, it would probably be best to do that in a sort of idea of looking at a specific participant or a smaller group in a case study over time and seeing how their perception changes with cultural factors and inputs. Thank you.
Terrific.